So it's not terribly common that I introduce the dean of the law school while sitting down, but that's what we're going to do in this instance. So for those of you who we didn't see yesterday, welcome. For those of you who we saw yesterday, welcome back. Thanks to Paul for moderating another fantastic panel. I'm John Hallway. I'm the executive director here at the Quattrone Center, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our still new dean, Sophia Lee, who will introduce our guest speakers, Lester Holt and Dan Slepian. The Quattrone Center has actually seen, Sophia is our third full-time dean, and we had an interim dean, and she became the dean of the faculty on July 1st of last year. And, you know, there's always kind of a white-knuckle moment when you get a new dean, when you're running a center like ours, and you never know kind of whether the new dean is going to share your priorities or view of the world, and they're going to have their own priorities, and if it's somebody from the outside, they have to take their time and get their bearings. And so it was when Sophia Lee was named as our dean, I'm pretty sure over at the White Dog Cafe across the street, they heard the collective sigh of relief and collection of high fives that happened. It was just a really wonderful decision to bring her on as the dean. She's been here at the law school for 15 years. She had before coming to law school was a social worker, so she totally gets what we do. She's been an incredible supporter of the organization. And in an organization that really prides itself on both brilliance and collegiality, Sophia really stands out. She is an absolutely lovely human being, and we could not be happier to have her leading us. And I'm so thrilled to be able to introduce her as our dean, Sophia Lee.
All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. So for those of you who are attending their very first symposium event, welcome to Penn Cary Law. And to those who were here yesterday or earlier this morning, welcome back. And we have an all-star lineup of speakers that have spanned practitioners to policymakers to advocates. And I understand from those who've been attending that this year's symposium has just been fantastic. And I'm so delighted to hear that. I think, however, as they say, the best is yet to come. So before introducing our next event, though, I do just want to take a moment to give a special shout out to the entire team at the Quattrone Center, the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice, for putting together this outstanding array of programming. The Quattrone Center's mission is to leverage research and policy to catalyze long-term structural improvements in the U.S. criminal justice system. Over the years, the center has become a national hub for scholarship and engagement. And it brings a system-level approach to such issues as wrongful conviction, incarcerations, and prosecutions, as well as to disparate outcomes. I don't even know. Okay. We cannot do any of this critical work really without the transformative support of Frank Quattrone and Denise Federaro Quattrone. It was their generosity and their great vision that led to the creation of the Quattrone Center in 2013. All of us at Penn Cary Law and all of the many people that the Quattrone Center's work has touched over the years owe them both an enormous thanks and gratitude. And I would hope you would all just join me for a moment here to give that thanks and gratitude. Wonderful, thank you. So one quick programming note that I've been asked to share. There will be note cards circulating that you can use to record questions for the Q&A portion at the end of the event. And we'll have people circulating periodically to pick up those note cards. And so just keep an eye out for them and hand them over when they stop by. Now I am honored to have the privilege of introducing our distinguished guests. We are thrilled to have with us two household names in news broadcasting who, frankly, need little introduction, but I'm going to give it a try anyway. So Lester Holt is an award-winning journalist at NBC News. He's the anchor and managing editor of the network's flagship award-winning broadcast, NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. The show recently celebrated its 75th anniversary. He's also the anchor of Dateline NBC. And during a broadcast and television career that spans more than 40 years, Mr. Holt has consistently delivered insightful and objective on-the-ground commentary about the most important issues and events of our time. His list of awards and accolades could take up all the time we have today, but suffice it to say that he more than lives up to his billing as the most trusted television news personality in America. One of Mr. Holt's trademarks is his on-the-ground approach to reporting and his commitment to providing viewers with first-person accounts when disaster and tragedy strikes. In the past 3 years alone, he's anchored NBC nightly news from around the world, including from Ukraine, Iran, Guatemala, and Israel. He's conducted exclusive headline-making interviews, including with President Biden, Vice President Harris, Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, former U.S. Attorney General William Barr, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Mr. Holt's on-the-ground style has meshed well with his extensive review of the American criminal justice system, a dedicated, years-long effort that he has pursued with his friend, colleague, and frequent producer, Dan Slepian. Now, over his more than 24 decades at NBC, Mr. Slepian has spearheaded dozens of documentaries and hidden camera investigations. He's known for his in-depth reporting about the criminal legal system and specifically about wrongful convictions. His documentaries on the topic have earned him a total of 14 Emmy nominations. He's a veteran producer of NBC's signature news magazine, Dateline. And last February, he hosted Letters from Sing Sing, an 8-episode podcast that hit #1 on Apple's top charts the day of its release. Mr. Holt and Mr. Slepian have done a lot of stories together over the years. I expect that none, however, are more memorable than the time they spent 2 nights together in Louisiana State Penitentiary. This is the largest maximum security prison in the United States, and it's commonly known as Angola. They were there as part of a 2019 NBC News and MSNBC series about the criminal justice system. Together, they produced from Angola what would go on to become an Emmy-nominated town hall that highlighted mass incarceration and the many complex issues around it. Now, they've shared with us a video that gives a behind-the-scenes look at how this groundbreaking journalism came together. And so, hopefully now, magically behind us on the screens are going to appear this video. There we go.
I've done a lot of stories over the years. By far, this is the most difficult hour I've produced at Dateline. There's a lot of moving parts to it. I'll never forget the day that I walked into Lester's office and said, "Would you think about spending 2 nights in the Louisiana State Penitentiary?" He laughed a little and then realized I was being serious. And he said, "If you can get permission to do it, I'll do it." The first thing you do is look for people and hear what their stories are. Over the course of several trips, I went and I spoke with a lot of these guys. Who are they? And that's how I came to meet Javante Sanders, who had been at Angola for a year at that point, and he had a life sentence.
And how old are you? 27, about to be 28.
Many of these men don't watch TV and have never seen Lester Holt before.
That's Lester Holt right there. You might recognize him.
So what I needed to do is explain to them who Lester was, what his role was.
Lester, nice to meet you. Yeah, oh, yeah? Nice to meet you.
He's not just an anchorman.
What do they call this job?
He's a reporter at heart. He wants to be in the field. He wants to be talking to people and hearing their stories.
So this particular job is not one of the more desired ones?
No, this is the loudest barrel. Field, nobody wants to be in the field.
There was one scene that I knew that I wanted, one scene that was important to get right, and that was Lester working in the field alongside incarcerated men on this former slave plantation.
Are you afraid for your children?
Yeah, I definitely am. I mean, when I grew up, I didn't know my father.
On my very first trip to Angola, I asked to meet the longest serving there. And I was introduced to a man named Sammy Robinson.
Do you think that you're a danger to society?
No. He was 17 years old when he was convicted and sent to Angola in 1953. He's been there for 66 years.
That's my NBC warden.
I felt it was important that I experienced what he experienced so we could be as authentic as possible when we were telling this story. And also there were logistical concerns. If there was any safety issues, I wasn't going to leave him there by himself. It was about, I don't know, 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and Lester said, okay, I'm going to hit the hay.
See you in the morning.
And I thought, hit the hay, we're in a maximum security prison. So about 5 minutes later, I check, and he's like sound asleep in the cell next to me. I'm thinking, how is he sleeping? I was up the entire night.
It's okay. It's what adrenaline is made for.
We had pretty much unrestricted access walking through Angola prison. There wasn't often a lot of security around us. And, Lester wasn't afraid. He was aware. And so was I. My responsibility is to make sure that nothing happens to him. So there were times that I would walk between him and these guys that were in the hallway.
Try and think of something to reach the person that you'll never see on television.
I've been working on criminal justice reform stories for more than 20 years. I have witnessed from the front lines how this system can affect individuals, families, entire communities. In many ways, this project was 20 years plus in the making for me.
There's one phone at the end of the pier.
Lester was embedded in the prison as a war correspondent, might be in a war zone. It gave us proximity. It's a place that's been dark for a long time. I hope that we can shine a little light onto this story for people.
I appreciate Dean Lee referring to both of us as household names. Very kind of
I did
Dean.
punch you down, I'm not going to lie.
Other than my mother's house, I don't. I said in there, in that video, that I walked in. For those of you who are familiar with the show Seinfeld, I'm like Kramer. Barge into Lester's office without any notice. And did you think I was joking, crazy, maybe both?
Well, I mean, you talked about the fact that you came up with this idea. What do you think about spending 2 nights in the Louisiana prison? And I remember going, yeah, sure, like, are you kidding me? And then when I understood what you wanted to do, I said yes. In the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, I can say yes, but we all know that our bosses and Louisiana State Correction System aren't going to allow this to happen. But this guy has a way of opening doors, including cell doors.
Actually, the story about this story to me is how we actually got the story done, and how we got it over the line to get it on TV. And we're going to tell you that story later. You know why? I'll tell you after this commercial break. Narrative matters, right? We will tell you the story, how we got it done, but I want to take a step back first. And we're not here to hear from me, we're here to hear from Lester. I always love listening to Lester talk. I just want to not embarrass him too much. But Lester is not only a dear friend of mine, he's my mentor and a champion. He has a huge, he doesn't do this very often. He's on the air every single night, live, and has a very busy job, as you can imagine. And when he comes out and speaks, it's for an important reason that he cares about. And this afternoon, in a few hours from now, he has an enormous, huge interview. But he still is here and woke up early this morning to be here to talk about this. I thank you for that, and I know that everybody else thanks you for that as well. And thank you for all you do, because you've made my job infinitely easier, because none of this would be done without you. And I love you to death. All right, so that's my part. Let's just take a step back, Lester, and why don't we start talking about you and as a young reporter, and when you became aware of this issue, and just your time as a young reporter.
Yeah, first of all, Dan, thank you for everything you said. We have a kind of a mutual admiration society, in case you haven't picked up on it here a little bit. In the car, we were going over, well, I think you should talk more. No, you should talk more.
Believe me, they want to hear you.
But this is a topic that is near and dear to both of our hearts, so happy to talk about it. My experience, I'll just give you a quick thumbnail. I took a pretty unorthodox way of getting where I am today. I started working in radio when I was in high school. radio news when I was in college. Left college before graduation to pursue a reporting job in San Francisco. In both those places, I was kind of the crime reporter. They gave me I think it was a Jeep Cherokee. They outfitted it with two-way radios and police scanners, and I would, chase police calls and fire incidents, that sort of thing. But I really had an appreciation and enjoyed doing, crime reporting. But it was from a different point that I am now. It was from a point of, the people that we covered that were getting arrested likely did it, and I didn't question it in perhaps the way that I do now, where I examine, every case that comes before us and, for its veracity. And so that was an important part, and then I moved to television, did more crime reporting. I think probably the turning point that really tuned me to some of the issues we're faced today in criminal justice and criminal justice reform was in the late 90s. I was a witness to an execution, a media witness in Illinois. George Delvecchio was the condemned person. Remember that night, I think it was a midnight execution, but they brought us into the execution room, separated by glass from Mr. Delvecchio, watching this process, this very formal process take place, one that I really had never really thought much about. Society, supported the idea of death penalty. I never really questioned it. But watching the process and the warden with the headsets on and, proceed and just the rehearsed nature of it, I had this overwhelming urge to want to go, hold on a second. Can we just stop here and just talk this through a little bit so I understand? The state's about to take a life. I'm not taking a position, but you can't witness something like that without questioning or thinking about this process, what's behind it, who's behind it, and why we do it. And that was probably the first moment that I began to look at the criminal justice system through a different lens of how we apply it. What our ultimate goal is. Is our ultimate goal to make the world safer, to make our cities safer, or is it retribution? I think these are all important questions that we have to ask. And so, I approached it that way. Dan and I started working together, about 10 years ago?
Longer than that, my friend.
Longer than 10
When
years.
you get older, age starts.
I'll let you know when I get there. But Dan began introducing me to stories, some of which I was incredulous. He would either do his Kramer moment where he bursts in the door or a blitz of emails. But some of the stories he would bring me that were potential wrongful conviction cases, I remember looking at them and reading it through, and I'm like, well, I don't understand. What's the issue? This person clearly, deserves a new trial, or whatever the case may be. And that's when I began to understand the complexities of how our system, what our system aspires to be, and what it sometimes does in terms of not looking at things through, I guess, as a layman, kind of a common sense lens. And we began doing some important, and I hope people recognize as some very important work, not only in the area of wrongful convictions, but also getting into the heart, going into the prison, going into the heart of the criminal justice system. Mass incarceration has really defined a lot of our work. And it's been an eye-opener for me, and I try to present it that way to the viewer as well, that these are areas that sometimes are not explored. As we'll talk in a moment, they're difficult stories. People wake up, they read headlines of another person pushed in front of a subway, another person beaten down on the streets. It creates a narrative, that the world is dangerous, more dangerous than it has been. We can talk in a moment about statistics. We know that's not the case in many of these instances. But fear is out there, and we need to be able to tell these stories in a way that can get past the fear and the emotion and help people understand what exactly is happening, why it may be happening, and give it some historical perspective. And Dan, I know you and I were talking about some of those cases. In fact, you've got some documentation on one.
I do. Yeah, I'll just, before I show that, read that documentation, which I find interesting, looking back more than a decade ago. For me, this is an issue that I wasn't looking for. This is an issue that found me, in that I had done a story with police officers. It was right after 9/11. And, you know, the NYPD were the rock stars of the city, the heroes of the country. And I thought, I think that viewers would be interested in riding along with the NYPD to see what they did. And so I got embedded with the NYPD in the Bronx, and I was assigned, a detective was assigned to me, a homicide detective, and I'm following murders for a couple of weeks. And I say to him, we formed a special bond, his name was Bobby. I say to him, you know, you must bring this job home with you, everything that you see. And he says, I really don't, except this one case has been bothering me for a decade. That's like a producer's dream. What's that about? And he says, there was a murder at the Palladium nightclub in 1990 in Manhattan. I never heard about it. I was a Bronx detective, but I was taking down a gang in the Bronx, and I know who did it. These two guys named Joey and Spanky. And we started reinvestigating that case. And on camera, he finds information in front of my camera that the Manhattan DA's office, for lack of a better term, didn't turn over. Saying Joey and Spanky from 550 East 139th Street did it like a 911 call minutes after the crime. Spanky's sister-in-law saying he tried to rape me and he did the Palladium murder. He was even identified as a witness, but the problem was, as a suspect, but the problem was is that they had two other guys locked up. And through that experience, what happened was is that when Bobby found that information, he goes to his bosses at the legal division, and he says, what's my obligation? I've got Dateline following me around. And eventually, his bosses ordered him to remain silent. He was kicked off the case. I was kicked out. He quit his job as a detective. He's a first-grade homicide detective in New York. He quit his job as a detective to talk to me on camera about it. And then the DA's office started to reinvestigate the case. And I started talking to the assistant district attorney in Manhattan. And about a year into his investigation, he says, yeah, these guys are innocent. He was ordered to protect the convictions. He quit his job to talk to me on camera about it. This was all on TV, nominated for an Emmy, I should say. Didn't win, but what I'm telling you, like, even when I say it, I almost can't believe it. But it really happened. And it really happened because I see it on TV sometimes. He quit his job to talk to me on camera about it. I continued to investigate the case. I find the real killer. I find Spanky. I bring him to Rockefeller Center. He basically confesses on tape. And David Lemus, the innocent guy, was released. But to this day, after 15 years in prison, but to this day, and that was in 2005, not only has the Manhattan District Attorney's Office never admitted they were wrong, they retried David Lemus. Spanky got on the stand during the retrial, swore an oath and said, I'm the killer, I don't know that guy. And he was acquitted. That was my baptism. That was my introduction into the pathology of this criminal legal system. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing, because if a cop and a prosecutor, whose job it is to lock people up, can't get their own system to listen, what else am I missing? So for me, it was the innocence movement that actually, and what happened was is that David Lemus shared a wall in prison with a guy named J.J. Velasquez, and J.J. says, I'm innocent too, and wrote me a letter in 2002, and I spent 10 years investigating his case and did a story about that. He only got out a couple of years ago after 23 years in prison. He led me to 4 other people that I did stories on, one of which Lester did with me, that helped get them out. So the further I got into this issue, I realized the pathology of it, because I felt like a character in a Kafka novel. Like, this is a bottle of water. We can all agree this is water. But some DAs will tell you that it's an elephant. And you're like, no, I think we can all say it's water, right? And so the more I learned about this, and the more people I spoke with, people like my friend Jeffrey Deskovich, who was wrongfully convicted and spent 16 years in prison, I learned how, and I keep using this word, pathological it is. And it didn't just come for me through wrongful convictions, because it was the prism of innocence that opened the door to me of the humanity of everyone in prison. And so by the time I came to Leicester in 2011, I think it was, I had done that story in 2005. And these stories, you know, Liz Cole and Paul Ryan, my bosses at Dateline and every other network, by the way, they care about these stories. It's not that they don't care about stories like these, but this is a business. And what happens is, in reality, these stories often fail to gain traction with audiences. So it's very, very, very hard to sell the stories. So what am I going to do? Lester Holt, right? So Lester becomes the savior of my life, and a lot of other people, by the way, for taking this on. And I think, and he can speak for himself, but I think when we started, it was also maybe an evolution for him as well. And the documentation that he's referring to, I looked last night at this email. I went back. Good thing I'm an organized dude sometimes. So there was a story about a guy named Darrell Kelly. It was 2011, I found out about him. And he was in prison for raping his daughter when she was 9. She was at the point, now she was like 22. But when she was 6 months after the conviction, she came forward and said, my mother, who was a drug addict, forced me to say this. It never happened. And no one believed her. Well, because Lester's Lester, I was able to secure an interview with the mother, who's now drug-free. She said, I did. I made her say this. It didn't happen. The daughter, who's in her 20s and has a child, is visiting her father in prison, trying to get him out. So I'm like, Lester, we got to do this story. So I sent him, I go and visit Lester, Kramer-like, and I gave him some information, and I looked for this email, and this is what he sent me in 2011. I said, Lester, I know how busy you are. Just let me know what you think when you get the time to read it. This is Lester's response. Oh, okay, I read this stuff. What am I missing here? It seems open and shut that he didn't do it. Is there another side to this? Something here that should make me skeptical or even smell a conspiracy? And the answer was, and I think he knows now, no. Because that's the way the system works. And we've done story after story after that that has proven that. So I don't know if that was a turning point for you, but the idea that people can be ripped from their lives, literally kidnapped by the state, thrown in a cell with scant, precious little evidence, and nobody seems to care.
We did another story, Richard Rosario, who was arrested, tried, convicted of murder. He had 13 alibi witnesses. The murder happened, it was the Bronx, right? Murder happened in the Bronx. He says, well, I was in Florida on that date. They had 13 alibi witnesses, including a local sheriff in Florida, some other folks, the wife of his friend who was about to go through labor, so she clearly remembered the day
and didn't
when
like
he was
him.
there. And by the way, didn't like him, didn't want him sleeping on her couch. So it was seared in her memory. 13 alibi witnesses, and they were not investigated.
So, yeah, so I found out about that story. I went to Florida, and I drove around Florida. He literally kind of knocked on the door of the precinct in 1996, saying, I hear you're looking for me. I was in Florida. And he's the one that gave names, contact information, phone numbers to the police. For 20 years, no one from the NYPD or the Bronx District Attorney's Office ever called those people. And there were 2 eyewitnesses, and his defense attorneys dropped the ball for various reasons. And yeah, as Lester says, one of the alibi witnesses was a cop. Another was a correction officer. Another was a pastor. He had been denied every appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And so once I started to understand that, I started to become a student, more of a student of the system. And the more I become, and I still am, and the more I become a student of the system, I realize how, again, pathological it is from every perspective. In other words, just yesterday, for example, or the other day, there was a tragedy, as you all may know, in New York. Terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy, where an officer was shot. Officer Jonathan Diller, who left behind a wife, young wife, and a 1-year-old child. Horrible. The headline of the New York Post was, officer's wife in eulogy slams politician for spiraling crime in New York. The only problem is that there isn't spiraling crime in New York. So what I've come to understand is that these issues that we're talking about, not only wrongful convictions, the whole legal system, is based on nothing but gut emotion. It's based on what we feel should be right, what we're angry about, what we think should be done. And what happens is people who read those stories vote for politicians who pass laws without any deliberation or analysis as to whether those laws actually work or not. And what ends up happening, as many of you know, is that laws are passed that cost us a lot more money to make us less safe. And so when that's right in front of me, and there's, you know, we did that sizzle reel in this project in 2019. That was the year before George Floyd died. So we were at this for a while. And actually, we should tell that story, unless you have another one that you want to tell.
No, I was just going to point that not all our work is wrongful conviction. A lot of it is based on this notion of mass incarceration and what that's costing us as a country, and, you know, how we're responding.
Exactly. Which now I'm going to circle the loop back about how we got that done. Lester was invited to, Lester and I were invited to go tour prisons in Germany and Norway in 2018, where they administer justice very different. It's based on 2 words, human dignity. And so Lester couldn't go because he's Lester, and he's on the air every night. But intellectually, I knew what was happening. But when I was there was a very tactile, emotional reaction to see, oh, we can do this a different way. I could see it. Officers there are trained in social work. A good day there is to help somebody not come back to prison. A good day here is to go home alive. There, you wear your own clothes. Here, you're shaved and wear a uniform. There, you close your door. Here, you have a check every hour. There, you eat fresh food. Here, you eat processed food, right? So there's all sorts of differences. And I came back on fire on that flight. And I had this idea, and then I became Kramer on speed. And walked into Lester's office. I was like, I got an idea. You know, this week-long series called Justice for All. Every show on NBC News and MSNBC does a story about criminal justice reform. Let's do the first ever town hall meeting at Sing Sing with incarcerated people there. And how about we try and get you locked up for 2 nights in Angola? And if I had said that to anybody but Lester, I either would have been fired or laughed out of the room. So when we talk about narrative, what we needed to do, what I felt we needed to do, is we needed to create our own narrative internally to even get this project done.
Yeah. Before we go there, let me just point out that one of the caution flags I did, once I got wind of the idea that he was actually serious about this, one of the caution flags is I didn't want it to be a stunt. And these kinds of things can be stunts. Hey, I'm going to play a prisoner for a couple of nights. I didn't want that. I thought Dan had a very eloquent way of putting it. It's like being embedded, you know, in a war zone. I've been with the military in war zones, and yes, you put on a helmet and flak vest because that's what you need. I'm not playing soldier. I'm not a soldier. I just need to be close to you to understand what a soldier does and understand this war you're fighting. That was the approach that was paramount to me, that if we're going to do this, let's have a reason for it, and let's be able to come back and with a texture for what mass incarceration looks like from the inside.
And that was our guiding North Star following that. And I thought that there was nothing more important than America's most beloved human being, as far as I'm concerned, to be among people, human beings, to show what's really happening when people don't see it. So what we did is we formed our own narrative and had this idea. I put together a sizzle reel with my friend Kim, who's another producer of Lester's, and we made a graphic, and we had an audience of one person, which was the president of NBC News. And we spent all this time making a 3-minute sizzle reel just to sell this concept. And we have it here. That's the second clip there, Ben.
Obviously, your best day was getting out of prison. What was the lowest day?
Every time I think about that cell.
Like so many other people, I'd heard about criminal justice reform, but over the last couple of years, I've done story after story after story that has really opened up my eyes in a different way. What is it like being in prison?
It's terrible. Being in prison, being in jail with other individuals that have been in here before. And they can see when somebody's not supposed to be there. You're going through the pits of hell.
We think of jails and prisons as places we put anybody we don't like. Anybody who's not doing exactly what we tell them to do. We ought to be thinking about jails and prisons as the place we put people who absolutely cannot be managed any other way, who are a threat to public safety.
I'm not saying that nobody deserves to go to prison. People should have fair chances that everyone has. They say everyone should be equal.
A quarter of the world's prison population is in this country, whereas we only represent 5% of the world's population. There are something like 2.3 million people behind bars right now. That works out about 1 in every 37 people.
We have become the most punitive society in the world. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world.
The rate of incarceration in this country, you look at that against a chart against NATO countries, you have to look at the numbers and understand this isn't working. What we're looking at is a national crisis. It affects mental health. It affects families.
You know, we live in a country where the Bureau of Justice predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison, and nobody seems to be upset about that.
1 in 3. It's astounding. I remember in my days as a street reporter in Chicago talking to kids who would say, you know, my only choice is I'm either going to end up dead or I'm going to end up in prison.
I think everyone should be held accountable when they break the law. It's not fine for us to create an industry of putting people in jails and prisons who are not a threat to public safety.
95% of the people behind bars, they're coming home. They're going to be your neighbors. They're going to be, you know, walking down the same street that you walk down.
I do believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think if someone has a gun, they're not just a thug. I think even if someone takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. And we owe it to ourselves to create a kind of society where humans have the ability to stand back up.
My daughter, I need to get home to her and be a father.
Our job is to shine light in dark places. This is not a one-off discussion. This isn't a spot on nightly news and interview on MSNBC. This is where we really leverage our reach across the entire NBC News brand, because there are so many stories within this story that need to be told. There's a lot of territory to cover, and so we have to commit to this, that we're doing this.
That was for an audience of one person. And I make no apologies for it, but I thank God for you, because it's like, you say no to the face of NBC News, you know, and it was Lester that got that, and it all, by the way, it all happened. All of it happened. One of the people that, you know, first we saw Brian Stevenson in there, we'll talk about that in a minute, but some of the people that we met at Angola, I think was moving for both of us. I don't know if you want to talk about your experience at hospice or with Henry Montgomery.
Montgomery. I mean, first of all, Brian Stevenson, I've gotten to know rather well over the last few years, and he's one of those people who really opening eyes about the legacy in this country going back to slavery to mass incarceration today. There's a through line, and he tells it. I was in Montgomery just a few weeks ago. He tells it through what they call the legacy museums. They have one that's focused on that journey from slavery to mass incarceration, another that focuses on the brutal history of lynching in this country, and then one they're opening up any day now, where it's a sculpture park dedicated, memorial, if you will, to the enslaved people in this country. But to your point about this program, we wanted to explain why we wanted to do this and remind of our power, our influence at NBC News. We have the people, the ability, the resources to put on this kind of project, and we got a green light on it. And it was still a little bit of uphill. It was one of those like, okay, they said yes, now what do we do?
Exactly.
We've got to deliver. But we ended up doing an hour on the 2 days at Angola, and then staged a town hall meeting that included incarcerated individuals at Sing Sing prison in New York. So it was a huge commitment.
And again, Brian Stevenson, proximity matters, right? Which it's so true. And even all these years doing this, just in that experience, and by the way, I know there's not 2.3 million people in prison anymore. That was in 2019. But, just as one example about things that you look at and you're like, why is this happening? If you think about it objectively, we met a man named Henry Montgomery who was locked up when he was 17 years old, the month that JFK was assassinated. And he was a scared young man in the Deep South, thought a white guy was going to attack him. He had his grandfather's gun. He shot him. He hid the gun in his grandfather's barn, and the town looked for every black teenager in the entire town. And he comes forward and he says, I did it. I hid the gun up there in the barn, and he went to prison. At first, he faced the death penalty. But when we got there in 2019, he was still there. And what was interesting about Henry was that he was sentenced to life without parole as a juvenile. Miller versus Alabama, for the lawyers in here, says that you can't sentence a juvenile to life without parole. Montgomery sued. Montgomery versus Louisiana became the successor to that to make that law retroactive. So hundreds of people got out of prison under Montgomery versus Louisiana. But when we got there, Henry Montgomery was still in prison. And in fact, Lester was with him. We were both with him the day he had his parole hearing. There's in Louisiana at the time, you needed a consensus of 3 parole officers to say yes, to get out. He could hardly hear. He was deaf. First person says, the guy spent 60 years, old man, sweet. First parole officer says, Mr. Montgomery, good luck to you. Go on with your life. Second guy said, Mr. Montgomery, I think you've done enough. Thank you. Go on with your life. Good luck to you. Third guy says, Mr. Montgomery, I think you need more programming. That guy by his day job is a physical therapist, by the way. And he was denied parole. And he spent another 2 years in prison.
And I met him minutes after he walked out of that parole hearing. He was describing how he essentially packed his bags. He was ready to go. And what I felt there was not necessarily a sympathy, but I was seeing people who I'd never seen before. Being in that prison, hearing personal stories, and it's almost chilling when you realize, how close all of our lives are intertwined, and what might have been for them. I think seeing these old men also was a strange experience, because you don't think about it. When somebody gets sentenced to life in prison, they're life in prison, and society's better for it. But to suddenly see eye to eye with people in their twilight years, whose only life they've really known has been behind bars, it's an eye opener. And one of the things that we did the Sing Sing town hall, I have in my office hanging a picture of that town hall, and you see the incarcerated individuals, and you see the audience. And each one of those individuals wrote me a note on this picture, and most of them were of a thank you for seeing us, thank you for listening to us. Nobody came up to me and said, hey, I'm innocent. They just appreciated being heard and seen, and to have their stories told in a way they haven't been told before.
I mean, you're a hero to most people in prison because they see your stories. You know, and that's it, you bring up, I'm innocent. It's interesting, these tropes, these narrative matters, right? So many times I've said to people, oh yeah, this guy's innocent. Oh yeah, everybody in prison says they're innocent. How many times have we heard that? Right? You walk through any prison, my guarantee 75% of those people in prison will tell you that they did what they were convicted of. So, like, we believe these tropes because they make sense. But in reality, it doesn't make sense. Science says it does. We know people age out of crime. We know Henry Montgomery is not a threat to anybody, right? So why is he still in prison? Why? What are we doing as a society? You know, and at the end of the day, these conversations remind me that we're talking about policy. We're talking about what doesn't make sense. All of these things are about people. It affects human beings, their families, their communities, all of society in ways that's hard to measure. Lester and I did a story in 2022 about a young black man named Anton Black on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was 19 years old. He had schizophrenia. It was in Greensboro, Maryland, a 4-person police force. Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad literally ran through Greensboro. And they were about to hire a new officer. And the black community and the NAACP says, you can't hire this guy. Look at what he did in Delaware 2 years ago. And what he did was he kicked a man in the face who was on his hands and knees like it was a field goal and his head was the football. And
the video existed.
And the video existed, yeah. And he was arrested, the cop. He was acquitted in Delaware. And he was ordered never to be, he was given a couple $100,000 and said, you can never be a cop here again. So he drove 20 miles over the state line and got a job in Greensboro. And the black community came out, the NAACP came out and said, you can't hire this guy, he's gonna kill somebody. 6 months later, Anton was dead. That was a hard story to get done, and there's only one reason we got it done. Lester became a champion for it, thank God. And we aired it. Again, nominated for an Emmy that didn't win, but whatever. Not saying I'm bitter about that. No, but the reason I'm bringing this up is because when we talk about narrative and how it affects human beings, people, I don't know if anybody has ever seen a primetime hour about a young black man dead at the hands of police who's not named George Floyd, right? And it happens, as we know, quite often around the country. 3 days after our show aired, the family, his parents, had a press conference. This is a 37-second clip of what they said that I want you to see.
Didn't get to do none of that because they killed him in Greensboro for walking down the street playing with his cousin-in-law. And there's no justice. Nobody's charged. If it hadn't been for Lester Holt at Dateline, it would have never got out, just locally. This probably has happened to many people. Thank God for Dateline, Lester Holt now. At least they brought our story out. Maybe there's some more out there. But how do you kill somebody and nobody get charged? Come on now, that's not right. Come on. They killed this boy.
So,
different clip.
And that was a story, by the way,
Didn't
that
get to
was
do none
not,
of that.
it was getting coverage locally, but it received a little.
It hardly made it to Baltimore.
Yeah.
And they changed policing policies in 3 Eastern Shore towns after this story because of Lester. I keep saying because of Lester because it's true. I would never be able to, this is like the Dean Lee, says 2 household names. I could do none of this without Lester. And I think all of us in the criminal justice community and people who care about these issues know that he's the leader when it comes to telling these stories. And I think we'll always be a champion of it. And I feel very fortunate to be able to do these with him. Lester, there's a question here. Did witnessing an execution change you personally? And if so, how?
It did. Probably people listen to that question and think, so did it leave you for or against, or where were you? Obviously as a journalist, I don't necessarily discuss my feelings on matters such as that, but I can't deny it. It changed me. When I hear someone's up for execution or an appeal, I listen more carefully. I look at everything now when it comes to criminal justice. Is it making us safer? Because that's what I want. I want to be able to walk down the street and not fear, becoming a victim of a crime. I'm not sure everything I've seen in our reporting has helped me to understand if these things make us safer or not. But yes, it impacted me, not in the way I thought. I thought, it would be haunting. I mean, frankly, the mechanics of it all were I won't say they weren't haunting, but it was more the idea of the state taking a life, looking at it through that lens. Really, to this day, makes me think about it every time I hear, someone facing the death penalty.
Yeah, here's another question: has innocence work hurt you? The symposium has discussed secondary trauma and harm. Hurt, I'm going to take that to mean personally affected. Lester's a busy guy. Lester has a lot going on. He's moderating presidential debates, and I'm not saying this stuff doesn't sit with him, because I'm sure it does. For me, it's what I live. Some of my closest friends have been falsely accused and imprisoned. My John, Adrian, JJ, who I talked about, and I think they're going to announce later, actually it's announced today, I have a book coming out in September, and I'm not taking money from it, so I'm not trying to sell it. I'm trying to bring proximity and exonerees to classrooms so people can understand the humanity and what's at stake. And so with JJ, once I realized he was innocent and couldn't get anybody to admit this was water, I visited him over 250 times over 20 years at Sing Sing. And for me, it has taken a very, very big toll. Sleepless nights. I met his kids when they were 6 and 9. They're now like 30 and 27. I watched them grow up. He wrote me letters from years about how scared he was for them, and his older one ended up going to jail for 2 years. So I watched his mother, so the damage, the weight is, for me, is very heavy, because there's a guilt that comes along with that, having a platform to know that you have this platform to share these stories, even though they're so hard to get through the labyrinth of the bureaucracy. It's my mission. So it does affect me greatly. I think about it every single day. Okay, yeah. So, what are your thoughts about the risks and dangers of criminal defendants allowing the media to tell their stories? I don't know if you want to take that or me.
In terms of legal jeopardy, or?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question. Like the risks and dangers of criminal. I think everybody has a right to tell their story personally. It's all context matters.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this directly applies. I shared with you the story coming down here today. I never told you. When I was in Chicago, I was doing some reporting on Chicago Housing Authority, public housing, and open-air drug selling. And we had someone who had agreed to talk to us who was a reputed gang member. And we went at the appointed time, and he doesn't show up. We see people, selling drugs in the courtyard of the housing development. Finally, one of them comes over to us and says, "What are you guys doing? Who are you?" I said, "Well, we're from Channel 2." And I was really trying to get rid of him, and he kept pressing, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we're gonna talk to someone who can tell us what's going on around here." And He said, well, I can tell you. He said, I carry a gun, I sell drugs, and I tell you why. And well, as a news person, at some point you're like, well, yeah, that's a pretty compelling story. So he gets in front of the camera, I interview him. 2 days later, I'm in the newsroom. A colleague comes down the hall and says, hey, there's a guy looking for you up front. He says, you talked to his brother, and his brother's dead. And I stopped what I was doing and quickly made some calls. Turned out this guy had been essentially assassinated. Elevator door opens in the development, and he's shot and killed. I go out, it was his brother who was out in the lobby wanting to talk to me. He was not, I didn't know what to expect at that point. He wasn't angry, he just wanted me to know that his brother had a good heart. Yeah, he was wrapped up in the drugs and the culture and all that. But it was a moment that really struck me of the influence and the power of what we do every day. Our reach is incredible when you look at television news across the board, and certainly now in this digital age. And so what we do, what we report, how we report it matters. From that, I realized that putting people in danger, children, interviewing children, without parental permission. It's usually not a good practice anyway, but it's something that was impressed upon me, and really, it was certainly a turning point in my career that I matured, by 20 years overnight with that story. It was pretty profound.
Yeah, and what I try and do as much as I can is destigmatize this notion of us versus them. To me, there is no us versus them. It's all us. I had a car accident for the first time by myself on a rainy street about a year ago. I hit a tree, and the homeowner runs out. It sounds like thunder, and I was shaking. Nobody got hurt. And he was very nice to me. Next thing I know, state troopers are there. And shining a light in my eyes was a county road, and little did I know that the homeowner said to the cops, I think he's drunk. It was a Sunday. And I had had a Bloody Mary earlier that day. And it was 6 o'clock in the evening. I wasn't worried, but I was mindful, specifically with the work that I do. And they said, will you take a breathalyzer? And I said, do I need to call my lawyer? Everybody's shoulders went up, You could do that, you lose your license for 150 days. My wife is in the background. So I took a breathalyzer. It was 0.00001, whatever it was nothing. Everybody relaxed. The officer says, it's a rainy night, sir. I didn't even get a ticket. Just a rainy night, slip of the wheel, no big deal. But it got me thinking, what if I had 2 Bloody Marys that day? What if I had a beer before I went to pick up that burger? What if there was a child playing in a puddle behind that fence and I took a life? I'd be potentially looking at 25 to life. That doesn't make me a bad person. That makes me somebody who made a terribly, terribly bad choice. And I think that most of the prison population, the vast majority, overwhelmingly vast majority of the prison population, are those people. But actually, I'm worse because I'm older. I remember I volunteer at Sing Sing and helped start a group called Voices from Within with a group of men who were convicted, who were guilty of their crimes, who wanted to redefine what it meant to pay debt to society. And I remember speaking to Dario Pena, a great friend of mine. He was sentenced to 25 to life. He had killed 2 people. Every time he says something, it's like thought out. He doesn't talk until it's like right on down. And when I first met him, I'm like, you killed 2 people, dude. How do you live with that? And what he said to me was like a lightning bolt, because context matters. He said, I was 17 years old. My dad was in jail, my mother was in drugs. I was trying to go to school every day, and I was dodging bullets. My older brother was 8 years older than me. He told me I needed to be in his gang. I thought that was my family. I was a soldier in a war, and everybody knew the rules. It was kill or be killed. And when I turned 25, my frontal lobe developed, and I realized what I had done. And then he went on to get his master's degree. And then he spent another 20 years in prison, or 15 years in prison, right? So I'm not condoning what he did. But what I'm saying is not everybody is Ted Bundy. Not everybody is a serial killer. In fact, most of the prison population is not that way. I want to end with a little story and a 2-minute video, because I think this encapsulates for me what the stakes are. We talk about people and how this affects people. I told you about JJ and how this dude JJ got out of prison on executive clemency, was invited to the White House, got an apology in person from the President of the United States, and needed a piece of paper from his parole officer to go to D.C. to get that apology, right? He's clearly innocent. You could watch the show, listen to the podcast, Letters from Sing Sing, whatever. But I get this call after 21 years of knowing him. I was close with the warden. We call him superintendent. That's the name. I call him Soup. And he calls me on August 17th, 2021. And he says, I just heard from the governor's office. JJ's getting out. He's got executive clemency. I'm going to go tell him. I go, Soup, you cannot tell him without me. Run out of my house. My shoes are untied. Batteries are flying everywhere. And I get there. So I film the moment that he tells JJ he's getting clemency. But he doesn't walk free for another 3 weeks. Why? Because that's the way the system works. But I was there and spent the entire day with him when he walked free after 23 years, 7 months and 8 days, wrongfully convicted. And so what I did is I edited a little 2-minute video together of that first moment of where he's being told he has clemency, and here's the moment at the end where he walks.
So me and our good Deb Jackson, who happens to be the OD, she gets to experience this after so many years. We're going to tell J.J. Velasquez that he got executive clemency today. We just were notified minutes ago, half an hour ago, where I called you, you're here. I have to say, my 40 years of service, this is one of the more exciting times in my whole entire career.
Why is it so?
Because I know he doesn't belong here. Because I know he doesn't belong here, and he's going to do fantastic things.
How did it
when he
feel
gets
to
out.
be the one that's
I'm overwhelmed. I really am. Right? She said, I have goosebumps. I said, you don't even know. I've been working with him for 9 years. He's being transferred.
Where?
You don't know?
No.
You know where 50 Overlook Road is in Haverstraw, New York?
Absolutely.
That's where you're going, bro.
Thank you, man.
That's where we're going. God bless you. You deserve it. So
that's what our work is about.
Thank you for having us.
So Lester unfortunately has to immediately beat a quick exit and get back up to New York. I do want to take just one moment to say that available for purchase today on Amazon is Dan's new book, The Sing Sing Files, 1 Journalist, 6 Innocent Men, and a 20-Year Fight for Justice. We've been talking to Dan. If only there was a wrongful conviction center that could help him in his mission of helping exonerees share their voices. So I hope we'll be seeing a lot more of Dan and a lot more of these incredible voices and stories, because as they just showed you, narrative matters. So we'd like to give everybody a little chance to have this settle. And so, again, we'll come back at 12:15. We've got lunch for you all in the main area there. And we'll come back with Peter Stout and the Houston Forensic Science Center to talk about what transparency and quality in forensic science really looks like. Thanks.